All right. Okay, just to recap, my name is Ria Jane, and I am the first affirmative speaker in this debate. We are from Washington High School, and my partner is Renee Jo. If there's no further questions or anything else, my time begins now. Renee and I proudly affirm that this House, as a Pacific Island state, would reject Chinese developmental assistance. Let's go on to the top of case. As the affirmation, we affirm the resolution and argue that a Pacific Island state would reject economic assistance from China. This is a value round because of the word would in the resolution, because would is very similar to the word ought, and we are not debating a policy round because a policy round would use the word should. Therefore, we do not need to call for a specific state in the resolution. Okay, but rather in general, if Chinese developmental aid is worth accepting or not. Does my opponents have any questions on the topic? No? Awesome. All right, let's get into some background information. Currently, China is building a multinational coalition that answers to all of their demands. By offering loans to poor, unsuspecting countries, they rope countries in by forcing them to comply to their demands. China is building an international trade and infrastructure organization called the Belt and Road Initiative, or the BRI. I strongly urge everyone to write this down because this is really vital to the round. What does the BRI do? The BRI tells other countries that they are going to be helped by China, that they are going to offer assistance. And then China uses those loans from the countries to trap unsuspecting countries into debt traps and therefore ruin their economies. Though this is a hypothetical debate round, we can see that in historical precedent right now, the president of China, Xi Jinping, has been pursuing political and economic expansion. This leads me to my first contention, which is on economic control. Uniqueness one is economic dependence. China has their corporations dominate the Pacific Islands. They are never going to develop their own industries. Basically, China is going to be colonizing on these lands and exploiting them for labor. How is China going to do this? Because specifically of loans. We tell you that China gives loans to countries that are really bad because it looks like a big loan in the beginning, but the problem is China gives such a short time period to pay off these loans that it ends up that these small countries can never pay them back, and China knows it. That is really problematic. This is called debt trapping, and that's a really key reason why China is uniquely bad for small countries. If they cannot pay back the loan, China basically controls them. This example is seen with multiple countries such as Pakistan and Sri Lanka having to spend over 80% of their spending on repaying loans to China. So yes, they get spending initially, they get a ton of money, but then later on, China makes them so economically dependent that they never are able to pay it back. Secondly, the second uniqueness is on foreign competition. The Belt and Road Initiative was meant to help African nations increase their economic help and gain jobs, but what ended up happening is that all jobs that were created through the BRI ended up going to foreign or Chinese workers. That therefore there is no impact of jobs that you're seeing from Chinese help developmental assistance into Pacific Islander countries. The third uniqueness is military takeover. Cross-apply what we said about the debt. When China sees that a country is not paying off its debt, do you know what it does? It doesn't just say, okay, you get an extra extension on your loan, you get to pay it back. No, they do the most drastic measure. They literally go into the country and take over their bases. This is evident because China has literally gained a military base in Djibouti and is holding over half of the country's public debt. Another example that is very specific to this topic is how in 2018, China came close because it discussed co-developing 4 major ports and eventually a military base in Papua New Guinea, which is a Pacific Islander country, including at Lebram Naval Base on Manus Island. However, at the last minute, the talks for Papua New Guinea fell through, and instead, they partnered with Australia instead to redevelop the base without falling prey to these loans. Yes, you have a question?
If China's military bases in Djibouti represent a military takeover of Djibouti, do American military bases around the world and American troops stationed in other countries represent an American military takeover of those countries?
It depends, because we're talking specifically about China taking over those countries because those countries could not pay off their debt. That's our link story here. We're talking about specifically the reason why it took over Djibouti and the reason why it took a port over in Sri Lanka is because those countries could not pay back their debt. That's the point we're making. All right, that's from the argument about Papua New Guinea is from the Eurasian Times in case anyone wanted to know. On to the fourth uniqueness, which is on the environment. Right now, we can see that in a lot of places, islanders are super concerned about trade with China. One clear example is how in the Solomon Islands, China took over 65% of the Solomon Islands exports, and those exports were overwhelmingly timber or wood, which had a drastic effect on the island's ecosystem. That's really clear here because if you think about it, what are developing countries producing? They are producing things such as wood, things that like coal that require that hurting the environment. And if China takes those over and utilizes them to their own advantage, then they're simply taking it, they're simply like hurting the ecosystem, they're hurting the environment along with that. All right, so what happens when you like evaluate like if a Pacific Island state accepted Chinese developmental assistance? Since there's already so much historical precedent, we can clearly see that if a Pacific Islander state it does accept Chinese developmental assistance, it's uniquely problematic for a couple reasons. First of all, it takes away a country's economic and political autonomy. I'm just gonna go with it, economic autonomy. There's clear examples on how countries have been more economically dependent on China. They came in expecting to get jobs, and instead their jobs were taken away. People fell below the poverty line. But secondly, you can see that these countries are actually going to fall into more debt traps. Do you know what happens when countries get into debt traps? Well, let's look at a clear example. In Greece, for example, the country Greece fell into so much debt that they had to resort to these things called austerity measures. Austerity measures is when a country spends so much on paying off their debt, they are not able to pay for things that their people desperately need, like food and social services. This is exactly what's going to happen to other BRI countries and exactly what's going to happen to a Pacific Islander country. We want to stop this. But third and finally, we're going to be talking about how it hurts the environment. This link is pretty clear here. It's going to lead to more fossil fuel emission and more like overall hurting the ecosystems of the people in general, because developing countries specifically have an ecosystem that they need to protect. And if they rely everything on China, they do not have the funds to put into towards helping their ecosystem. The impacts here are pretty clear. We talk about poverty, we talk about economic downfall for all of these countries, and you can just look to our historical precedent of many other BRI countries who have been trapped in debt for like over 10 years. And finally, we talk about environmental degradation. Our contention too is US backlash. Expansion of China into the Pacific region has already caused a lot of heads turning, right? The problem is it'll lead to an escalation of an arms race because the United States will be concerned that China is going to take its economic control and will turn it into a military dominance. Look at what I said on the first contention about how China is literally taking over military bases. The United States will see China as a threat, which will lead to a more proliferation of arms and increased tensions because they do not want China taking over more military expansion. The United States will become more trigger happy and be more alarmed by Chinese growth. An ally of China is an enemy of the United States. We can see this clearly, and therefore the United States will fight back against Chinese growth. A big link here is geography. Geography is a key role because the Pacific Islands are close to the United States, which means when China expands into those islands, the US will see this as a threat and prepare for attack, meaning that there's going to be a race to the top. Think about Donald Trump. Do you really think he would be okay with China moving into an island that's literally super close to the United States? Our leadership is not prepared for this reality, and therefore the impact here is a clear United States-China war, meaning that those island states, those Pacific Island states, are caught up in the crossfire. Overall, judges, what are you voting on today? You're voting on the fact that the BRI has so much historical precedence of lack of economic control and the US-China war, and those are the reasons you're voting for the app. Thank you.
Okay. So, all right, my time starts now. Hello, my name is Aaron Yang. I am the first speaker for the negation, and I'll be explaining why you should be, so we negate the resolution that this House, a Pacific Island, would regret Chinese developmental aid. So, one thing that is important to, I'll first be going over the negations case, and then I'll be addressing the affirmations case, because one point from the negations case will be very important for the affirmation, for dealing with the affirmation. So our first contention is Chinese retaliation. Basically, China sees the Belt Road Initiative as being extremely important for maintaining for expanding its global power. In addition, it sees the Belt Road Initiative as a way to safeguard against America, because it allows China to be economically independent from America. As a result, China places a huge amount of value on the Belt Road Initiative, and will do anything and will reinforce it and bring these Pacific Islands into their sphere of influence through any means necessary. We can see this through the example of the Scarborough Reef dispute between China and the Philippines. Basically, China and the Philippines had a dispute over a piece of land in the South China Sea. China was willing to act against the orders of the International Criminal Court. The USA, Canada, France, UK, and Australia, and countless other countries, and constantly retaliate against the Philippines when the Philippines attempted to act against China. China launched cyber attacks, cut off tourism, restricted fruit exports, limited fishing in the South China Sea, and has continually harassed Filipino fishermen. All of these, all of this resulted in the Philippine President Duterte stating that it was impossible for China to be stopped. So what this shows is that if these countries reject the Belt Road Initiative and the loans it brings, they will simply be met by Chinese economic retaliation. And as Duterte said, they have no mechanism for fighting back. Even with the International Criminal Court, America, and all of these other countries acting against China, China was still able to put so much economic pressure on the Philippines that ultimately the Philippines were forced to back down. And right now, the Philippines has repaired its diplomatic relations with China, and the Filipino government has made statements stating that they will be willing to cooperate with China on infrastructure and economy. So what this shows is that if a country rejects the Belt Road Initiative, China will simply launch economic retaliation against them until they join the Belt Road Initiative anyways. So all this means is that if the Pacific Island countries reject the Belt Road Initiative, all that will happen is they will face huge economic losses, and then they will end up having to join the Belt Road Initiative anyways. So all of the affirmations points about the Belt Road Initiative are completely non-unique because they happen either way due to Chinese retaliation. And in fact, they become worse because if China uses these aggressive tactics, they're going to be trying to seize more power in these they're going to be gaining even more leverage over these countries, therefore gaining more control. In addition, China is also going to it's also going to cause more economic harm. More economic harm is going to be done to these countries if they reject the Belt Road Initiative because of China's financial retaliation. So yeah. Okay, so next up is economy. All of the Pacific Islands, they've experienced overall a GDP shrinkage of 4.3%. The tourism industry that they rely so much on has collapsed due to COVID-19. And many of these countries lack infrastructure. And right now, 1.2 million people in these Pacific Islands are in poverty. So what this means is that China is going to help them build infrastructure and provide financial aid, which is going to allow them to improve their economies and recover, therefore improving quality of life of their citizens. And even if you don't buy this, again, all the harms of the Belt Road Initiative are non-unique. Okay, so moving on to the affirmations points. So they have this very long point about the debt trap. So they say that China is going to force these countries into economic and political dependency. However, as I've already shown, this is completely non-unique because even if these countries reject the Belt Road Initiative, China is still going to be acting against them. We've seen this through the example of the Philippines, where China was able to overcome the resistance of some of the most powerful countries in the world and the International Criminal Court and force the Philippines into working with them in infrastructure and economy. So what this shows is that there is no way for these countries to escape the influence of China. So it's better for them they're going to accept the Belt Road Initiative because it's the only way to avoid Chinese retaliation. And in addition, it's worth noting that our opponents say that China is willing to militarily take over these countries. So if China is willing to take over these countries using the force of their military, they are without a doubt going to be willing to use economic retaliation. So what this means is that everything the affirmation says happens anyways, even if these countries whether these countries reject or accept the Belt Road Initiative, all of these things still happen. The only difference is whether or not these countries are are like able to are harmed economically by Chinese retaliation. In addition, there's also the impact that they probably won't receive loans if China is forcing them to ally with them. So they're not even receiving any loans if China is using these retaliatory tactics. So they're in fact getting less money, and their economy is going to collapse if they reject the Belt Road Initiative, which is why these countries are going to accept the Belt Road Initiative and the Chinese aid. Okay, so finally, there's the point of US backlash. So they bring up this idea of US backlash of saying that if these countries accept Chinese aid, that's going to push the US and China into a Cold War, and that's going to worsen things. But if China uses economic retaliation, which they are clearly going to do, that's going to actually accelerate the US-China Cold War, because China will be using more aggressive tactics, which will result in the US-China Cold War happening sooner. This will result in an even worse outcome for the Pacific Islands, which is why they will accept the Belt Road Initiative and Chinese aid. Okay, so finally, there's the point on the environment. So they say that these countries, like the Belt Road Initiative, is harming the economy, but this is completely non-unique. These countries are going to develop over time, and as history has shown, as countries develop, they naturally pollute. We can see this through the growth of America and Britain. As their economies grew, they polluted much more. It's not that China specifically is forcing these countries to pollute. It's just the product of economic forces that makes these countries pollute. They bring up wood being cut down in the Solomon Islands, but this is just the economy at work. Because the Solomon Islands has these wood resources, they are exporting them. It's supply and demand. So there's a high demand for the wood, so they export the wood. So regardless of whether or not the BRI is put in place, all of this economic damage is still going to happen because it's the product of economic forces, not China. So for all these reasons, I urge a strong vote for the negation.
Alrighty, everyone. Hi, my name is Renee. My pronouns are she, her. I'm going to be the second speaker on the affirmation. I'm going to start off with just a general overview of this round, then I'm going to move on to the negation case, and then I'll move on to the affirmation case.
How many minutes is this speech? Sorry.
Oh, this speech should be 8 minutes long.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Is there a specific sheet you want me to write the overview on?
You can kind of, well, actually, it's more of a top of case kind of thing. I'm going to be talking about the resolution, so you can write it wherever you copied down the resolution.
Sounds good. I'll put it on the top of sheet case.
Okay, cool. I will start the time. Now, judges, let's start by kind of going over the resolution. What is this round even about? This round is saying that this House as a Pacific Island state would reject Chinese developmental assistance. Now, the key word in this resolution is reject. This is saying that as the affirmation, we believe that these countries would reject any assistance that China is trying to give them economically, whereas the other team is arguing that they would accept this assistance, basically. And one of the biggest things that my opponents have just completely misunderstood in this round is that key word, reject. They don't understand. Let me explain. China wanted to take over an island, part of the Philippines in the South China Sea. That is what my opponents said. They said that China took over this island. Now, this is not the same as developmental assistance. Developmental assistance is consensual between both parties, whereas this example of the Philippines is completely non-consensual. China went in there and attacked the country. They had no control over whether China could go into that country. There was a complete seizure of land. This is actually more proof, actually, that China is only seeking power and is more dangerous. Developmental assistance is actually financial aid given by governments and other agencies to support economic, environmental, social, and political development of developing nations. That is the definition. Our opponents are basically saying that this one example of China taking over the Philippines is example of how other countries are going to accept Chinese dominance. This is simply not true. Now that we've got that kind of like in order, we can move on to the negation case, because all of their case relies on this one warrant of the Philippines accepting Chinese assistance. But really, nothing was accepted in this example. The only thing that was accepted, well, actually, nothing was accepted. The only thing that happened in this example was China invaded another country's land without their consent, which is just proof that China is completely destructive. Overall, this kind of refutes everything, but let's go on to their specific contentions. Other countries have they basically talked about the BRI, and basically other countries have rejected the Belt and Road Initiative before, and they're not going to get mad. China is just simply offering their aid to every single country. This does not mean that every country is going to accept it. These countries are smart. They know that China is a bad actor. And especially because of these examples like the Philippines, they're going to see that China is not a country that they should be taking aid from. Retaliation, and they basically say that China is going to retaliate from, you know, these countries not accepting their aid. But retaliation is simply not in China's best effort and interest. It makes the loans that they're giving out to these countries seem like they're bad and they're insincere. Other small countries are going to look to this example of the Philippines being seized and how if they reject any sort of loans, China's going to backlash on them. They're going to see this as China is dangerous. We're not going to even do any sort of like business deals with you at all because you seem like someone that's going to just turn on us, which is true. Now, another example I want to bring up is how we talked about how the military is specifically about debt. Only because of the debt assistance. It's not just China that is taking over these countries. Therefore, we're not linking into their example of how China is offering aid to every single country here. Really, let's move on to like the specific argument about the South China Sea. They say that like this dispute over the South China Sea, how China stole land from the Philippines is somehow an example of these countries accepting aid. That is not the same as I explained on the top of the case, that is not the same as developmental assistance. Assistance and automatic seizure of land without any sort of like consultation with that country is not the same. Philippines did not ask for a takeover of their entire island. Now, on to like their impact of quality of life and how like China giving them assistance is going to help them. Really, I mean, there's really no assistance being made, because if you look to our case, that's a great transition into our case where we talk about how these countries are only going to be economically dependent on China. They're only going to have military takeover, and they're only going to lead to the like destruction of their entire country. And it's going to put them in it's going to put them in a situation, in a climate in which the United States is going to see them as a threat. But I can re-explain some of those a little bit later. Let's go on to their specific refutations that they made on our two contentions. Now, on the first contention of how China is going to economically control these nations, they basically said that is non-unique, that this argument does not apply to the round at all, that China forced the Philippines to work with them. But as I said, the first thing that I said is that this example that they're using of the Philippines is not an example of developmental assistance. This is not an example of two countries, two parties making a consensual agreement to offer each other aid. This is an example of seizure that is not consensual, and they only have one example here. Overall, we really only have like two more responses to our entire case. They said that with foreign competition, they completely dropped this example of the Belt and Road Initiative. We basically showed you the historical example of how the Belt and Road Initiative is only taking jobs from African countries. This is an example that was completely dropped in this round. We have real examples of historical proof that China has repeatedly tried to take and exploit labor from other countries. And don't even get me started on the example of Pakistan and how they've increased the poverty rate because of exploitation of these countries. We have these examples, they've completely dropped them in this round. If China gives these countries assistance, it comes in the form of loans. These loans require these countries to pay China back, and that makes them be like, that puts them in debt. That debt leads to them being under the will and whim of China. They can do whatever they want to these countries. That is what the argument that we're making here, and they've just completely glossed over in their last speech. Now, on the contention too of U.S. backlash and how we're proving that because of the specific geographical location of these Pacific island countries, if any Chinese expansion occurs, the United States is going to look towards that, and they're going to see, oh, China is trying to invade on the United States. They completely dropped this entire thing. They only said that it's non-unique. What does that even mean? That's not even an argument. This is not non-unique at all. Now, let me just kind of overall like look at the round. We're completely winning on every single argument, whereas they're only relying on one example of the Philippines. I'm going to predict what my opponents are going to come up here and talk about in their next speech. They're basically going to say that the Belt and Road Initiative is non-unique. I mean, sure, if you want to think that it is non-unique, but in actuality, we can prevent other countries from using the same trap, the same tactics that China has used against these small countries that we've proven that are happening in Africa, are happening in Pakistan, are happening in all other small countries. Our case is proving that these small countries are doing something about it, and they're not going to take Chinese aid. And they also are going to probably come up here and try to defend their one warrant of the Philippines example and how China has taken over that country. But obviously, that does not fall under the definition of assistance. That is just taking over this country. So let's kind of weigh the two sides. What are we looking at here in this round, and who are you going to be voting for at the end of the day? If we have on our side historical precedents of China trying to debt trap other countries and Pacific Island countries, to be specific. We're the only team that has Pacific Island countries as an example. Even though the Philippines is a Pacific Island country, obviously I've already proven how that one example isn't proof. And they have no proof that China is actually going to be benefiting these countries in any way. Nowhere in their case do they talk about how China is beneficial, how they're helping these countries. China is only a bad actor, and that is the reason that you should be voting for the affirmation. I want to just one more time bring up that one example that my partner was talking about Papua New Guinea and how China is just taking advantage of these countries. You do not want these countries to fall into the trap, into the grasp of China, because they're only going to exploit them for labor, money, and power. And for those reasons, it's clear you need to vote on behalf of the affirmation. Thank you.
Okay, I'm gonna go the next case and then the abs case in order.
How long is the speech?
8 minutes.
Okay, thanks.
If everyone's ready, I'm gonna be starting my time. Just they completely misunderstand the narrative that we're going for, right? They come up and say that we say it's non-unique, and apparently non-unique means it doesn't happen. No, what we mean by non-unique is that even in the affirmation, they don't solve for the impacts that they're trying to go for. The example that we provide of Philippines is a prime example and will be the reason you will vote for the neg. So now let's talk about our go line by line. So let's go for the Chinese retaliation point. They can see the evidence that that China believes BRI is essential to China's survival because they want independence from US's economy. They completely concede this point. Now you might ask why it's important. The reason it's important is primarily because of this survival's need that China will do everything in its power to force assistance on these countries. The economic assistance that they keep on harboring about, yeah, exactly. That they're going to force on countries so that they can get a profit out of it. That's the entire narrative that we're going for. That's what we're trying to say, that no matter what you do, China, I'll take the question at the end if I have time, China will go and actually give assistance, even if they reject it, through retaliation. The entire idea of the Philippines point was meant as an example, right? So China stole land from the Philippines or forced Philippines to accept aid from them through infrastructure and economic cooperation. This shows that it's impossible for other Pacific islands to reject Chinese aid. Again, let me reiterate it. They forced Philippines to accept aid from them through infrastructure and economic cooperation. That's the whole development assistance idea we're talking about right now. They forced them. They went against America. They went against France. They went against so many court of laws, and China forced this upon Philippines, which means that they will force it upon other countries. So even if the Pacific Islands reject the assistance, China will force it upon them. That is what we're trying to say. So the entire that is the narrative that we're going for. So the reason why they will do this is to grow their power, and that is the biggest impact that over here, right? So okay, now let's go on to the second point, which is the economy point. They basically say that we don't give any real the only real refutation that we don't really. You can cross-apply their infrastructure point about how they will be super dependent on China for their economy. But there are a few responses here. One, the first response that I have to say over here is that the infrastructure that China built for these people is like infrastructure so that they can like create their own trade market, which means that they will not be heavily dependent on China. Additionally, after they pay off the loan, China actually doesn't have any relationship to this country. So they fundamentally misunderstand what the whole BRI point is saying in the first place. So that's their only two real responses into economy. Now let's go talk about their point. So for the economic dependency, they say that we say it's non-unique and we don't respond to the link change. So let's go by it line by line. The reason we say it's non-unique is because the affirmation doesn't solve for its impact. It's simple as that. The idea that apparently if you go with the AF's plan, all of the negative impacts will go. If you go with the AF's idea of like rejecting the resolution, all of these economic problems will go away is false, because this is not going to happen. This will happen no matter what, because China will take action. Additionally, let's talk about this debt trap, right? So they basically say that Pakistan and Sri Lanka have like a bunch of debt, and like it's because of China, right? So on May 27th, there was a China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, or CPEC, a project under BRI, is not a debt trap but a boon for Pakistan. It said that China is investing $62 billion in Pakistan through CPEC, which has enabled the country to avert its energy crisis and has helped them build an elaborate work of infrastructure in various parts of the country for the past 5 years. The CPEC has greatly boosted economic activity and improved people's lives, which means that this entire idea that BRI is actually negatively impacting these people's life is not true. Then let's talk about Sri Lanka. This port that they keep on referencing about how these ports were actually like negatively harming them is not true, because Sri Lanka gave this port to China because before like China was involved into like this with Sri Lanka's bases, that port was useless. There was no trade going on in that port. Right now, at this moment, like at this like time period, there's a lot of trade going in and out, which means that Sri Lanka makes a lot more money through that trade port. Now, let's talk about the other idea of okay. So what we're trying, and then my partner makes this response that goes cold-heartedly conceded that if these countries reject aid, they reject assistance, then not only will they not get the benefit from the loans, but they will just be under like Chinese like persecution. So like right now, like China's willingly giving them assistance and like actually doing it, but that benefit will go away the minute they reject it. So their entire idea that like by rejecting Chinese aid is that better, it just doesn't stand. Okay, the next thing let's talk about is okay, the next thing that let's talk about is the environmental damage. They don't really say yeah, they like completely drop our refutation on that point, which means that it flows through our side. Like if the economy is stimulated, there is going to be like environmental damage. That is how like supply and demand works, because like my partner gives like pure analysis on that idea, and like they completely drop that point. So that flows through our side. Now let's talk about the second advantage, which is the US backlash, right? So they basically say that apparently America will think that they're invading, like just because China is occupying like all of these Pacific states that they think they're invading. But there are a couple of responses to here, right? One, Chinese retaliation causes the acceleration of US-China Cold War. That's what we say. All of this flows through. What we're trying to say is that because China will forcibly put aid on these small islands, this will accelerate the speed through which US will like go against China. That is what we're trying to say. We're not saying that it's not going to happen. That is what we're saying. What we're saying is that it's going to be happening faster. Additionally, it's non-unique because China and like America, China and America are like very close to war, so they don't really solve for the impact, and it's going to be devastating to anyone who's involved in this, including the Pacific Islands. Okay, yeah. Additionally, America is more likely to respond to Chinese economic retaliation than financial aid. So if China like directly attacks America, they're probably going to do it through that than helping other countries, because that's more harmful to America than like financial aid. So what this brings us down to is like these very important impacts, right? This narrative that we're trying to tell you that China will, no matter what you think, that China will attack and will force upon this aid on the other countries, because that's the key for their power, right? And they don't contest this fact, which means that because of just this one like uniqueness offense that we have, you should vote for the neg, because in the affirmations world, they don't solve for any of their impacts. The quality of life impact that they bring up is not enough to put to outweigh the risk that China has of like to outweigh the risk that China will force upon their aid onto these countries. For all these reasons, you can clearly see that the negation side wins, because their impacts don't, like their entire case do not solve for their impacts. For these reasons, I just strong word the next side.
All right. So, is everyone ready?
Can I get an order?
Oh, okay. I'll be summarizing the debate, and then I'll be weighing, and then I'll be comparing the world of the affirmative to the world of the negation.
All right.
Okay. So, my time starts now. Hello, my name is Aaron Yang. I am the final speaker for the negation. I'll be explaining why we have won today's debate. So, the point that this debate ultimately comes down to is our point about Chinese retaliation. If we can prove this point true, then we invalidate both of our opponents' contentions, and we prove that rejecting the Belt Road Initiative and Chinese aid would result in even greater economic damage to these countries. So as long as we can prove this point true, we win today's debate. And we have certainly proved this point true in today's debate. Our opponents their only response to this has been to say that that Chinese retaliation to the Philippines cannot be compared to the Pacific Islands because of consent, that the Philippines didn't consent to this. But this is a complete misunderstanding of our point. Our point was not to say that these are perfectly analogous situations. Our point is to show how China responds to threats to its power. Our opponents have conceded that China sees the Belt Road Initiative as being essential to its survival, as it ensures their independence from the American economy. As a result, China sees any country rejecting the Belt Road Initiative as a threat to them, an existential threat, and they will respond that way. This can be seen through their response to the Philippines. When the Philippines tried to reduce Chinese power by objecting to China taking over Scarborough Reef, China responded with huge economic retaliation against their fishing, against their exports, against their tourism. And they acted against the will of the International Criminal Court, as well as many countries in the world. This just shows the lengths that China is willing to go to in order to grow their power. And since China sees the Belt Road Initiative as being essential to their survival, they're going to use these exact same measures to force Pacific Island countries to become dependent to them and to accept their financial aid. So what this means is that if a country rejects the Belt Road Initiative, not only are they going to face economic devastation at the hands of China, but they are also going to still have all of the impacts of the Belt Road Initiative happen to them because China will force them to accept these terms. In fact, they will probably have worse terms because China will be the one dictating everything in the negotiations. So we can even look at this in the Philippines. The Philippines, despite having their land stolen from them by China, have accepted Chinese economic aid. They have said that they will cooperate with China on infrastructure and economy, which shows that they will be accepting Chinese aid. The Philippines are a Pacific Island country, and they were ultimately forced to accept the Chinese aid due to the Belt Road Initiative. So what this shows is that these countries are either going to A, going to accept the Belt Road Initiative, or B, they're going to reject it and eventually be forced eventually be forced into it by China, resulting in a much greater negative impact to their economy than if they had simply not done it, which is why all the Pacific Island countries will accept the Belt Road Initiative. So this completely destroys all of our opponents' case. The point about Chinese dependency, these countries will still be forced into being dependent on China, so it's completely non-unique. And on the point of US backlash, again, this is completely non-unique. In fact, we turn this because Chinese retaliation is going to accelerate the US-China Cold War and bring a greater devastation to the Pacific Islands. So, and on the point of environment, that's completely dropped. So we have clearly shown that all the countries will eventually be forced to join the BRI due to Chinese retaliation, which is why these countries will all join the BRI. And for these reasons, I urge a strong vote for the negation.
All right, so last speech, just to recap, my name is Ria Jane, and I will be the last speaker for the affirmative team from Washington High School. So right before I start my speech, I'll be talking about what I will be doing in my last speech. First, I will be going over some main definitional issues. Then I will go ahead and disassemble the negation case. Finally, I will come back, talk about my affirmative case, and explain why you're voting for us. My time starts now. First of all, judges, I'd like to explain two things my opponents messed up. The first thing is the developmental assistance point. We specifically tell you that in the resolution, it states that these countries are going to reject Chinese developmental assistance. What is developmental assistance? The literal definition, as my partner stated, is financial aid given by governments and other agencies to support the economic, environmental, social, and political development of developing countries. First of all, we are literally telling you that China is going to be giving this developmental aid. That is why their Philippines example falls through. But second of all, even if you don't buy that, remember the word reject in the resolution. I'll be touching on this more later on, but the key point you need to take away here is that no matter what happens, it clearly states in the resolution that China is going to offer these countries some developmental assistance, and the country that is in the Pacific is going to reject it. That is rejection. That is exactly what we're talking about. We tell you for a fact, rejection is going to happen, okay? I will go onto this more into on the neg case and explain it in detail. All right, now let's talk about the negation case. The first thing that they bring up, the first thing that they collapse to, unfortunately, it's retaliation. And here's a couple reasons why retaliation is a terrible argument. First of all, they keep telling us over and over again, the BRI is key, the BRI is key, China is going to retaliate. China has had this happen before. Other countries have rejected the BRI, they have rejected Chinese developmental assistance, and China has not gotten mad. China has not got into war. Judge, if you want to buy this argument, then you have to believe that every single country that China offered their developmental aid to actually had to accept it, otherwise China went to war against them. And yet they do not provide a single example that shows that that countries rejected China's assistance and then China just went to war against them or just forcibly implemented measures, right? They only give one, but I'll touch on that later. Again, even if China somehow did retaliate, this would be really harmful for China in the long term, because if you hypothetically buy that this happens, realize, as my partner responded to, other countries that are small and in the Pacific recognize that China is not simply doing this out of the goodness of their heart. They're not going to look at these examples and want to work with China. They're going to reject the aid from China. Therefore, you can see that no matter what, retaliation isn't going to happen. It's never happened before. You can't vote on it. But let's go on to the second voter, which is mainly about the Philippines. The Philippines is, at this point, it's the last offense my opponents have left. And this makes me really mad because I have studied this situation in the Philippines, and my opponents want to completely misconstrue it. Let me explain again what the Philippines example is. China did not want to debt trap the Philippines. China did not want to offer developmental assistance to the Philippines. All China did was go into the South China Sea, take over a land by the Philippines, and then just called it a day. They did not offer developmental aid. And you know what my opponent comes up here in the last speech and says? He literally tells me that the Philippines joined the BRI. The Philippines is a floating island in the middle of the sea. How is it supposed to add on to an infrastructure project? This doesn't even make any sense. What Chinese aid are they talking about? They provide no examples. Judge,
voter, stop the time. The argument that the Philippines wouldn't be able to accept the BRI because they're an island nation is a new argument and cannot be brought up in this speech.
That's because the argument that the Philippines is going to be part of the BRI was brought up in your neg block, but it's taken into judge consideration.
Yeah, this is a panel, so we won't be disclosing our decisions, but we will all make them independently.
All right, sounds good. All right, my time resumes. Now, even if you don't buy that argument, remember my response that specifically stated that was not developmental assistance to a country. China never offered developmental assistance to the Philippines. This is a straight up lie by my opponents. You cannot vote on it, Judge. I urge you not to vote on it. Okay, now that I've successfully dismantled the negation case, let's talk about the affirmative and why we're winning. All right, so the main thing that they do in their neg block is try to attack our really specific examples about military takeover. Let's talk about these in more detail. First of all, they said Sri Lanka's port to China was useless. The port in Sri Lanka, yes, it wasn't active, but since China took it over, it's a booming port. It is huge, and all the benefits are going straight to China. So flow that straight to our side. Then they talk about Pakistan and how Pakistan's economy is doing great. You know whose Pakistan economy is not doing great for? The people in poverty, the people under the poverty line. Also, they didn't respond to my examples of Djibouti and Papua New Guinea about how China specifically debt trapped those countries, took over their military bases, or in Papua New Guinea's case, tried to take over a military base, and they succeeded, or they tried to succeed. Those examples are really why you were winning the argument. Now let me just go over and explain what exactly debt traps are. in the world of the affirmative, what happens is that China is going to try and give their economic help to these small countries. As it's happened in the BRI, these countries are going to fall for the trap. They're going to say, oh my God, these big loans, let's take them. And instead, what happens is they end up falling into these debt traps. We have countless examples and countless sources of this. This impacts out ultimately to the economy and the austerity measures of the people. Look to our Greece example, how they couldn't pay it off. And therefore, at the end of the day, you're evaluating Chinese retaliation probability versus debt traps actually happening in the status quo. I urge you to vote for the facts in this round and vote for the affirmative. Thank you.
Again, just as a reminder for all the judges, once I make my decision, I will let you all know, and then you can all send me your decisions so that we can make sure that we're all making independent ones.